The genotype of Proto-Semites. This will be from a old Earth perspective. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. Consider this video to be a summarization of this playlist that deals with the origins of Proto-Semites from an old Earth perspective for those that believe in an old Earth or that may be curious when it comes to an old Earth perspective for the origins of Proto-Semites. So again, this video is just summarizing this entire playlist, but I still recommend that you watch the playlist for full context of everything that I'm going to cover in this video. With that being said, let's dig in. Remember, our overall goal is to discover who are the ancient Hebrews of Israel and their descendants. Understanding the origins and genome of Proto-Semites is important since, according to the genealogy of Israel, they are a Semitic people. So, Genesis chapter 11, verse 10 through 26 says, "This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters." And then from verse 10 to 26, we have Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serg, Nahor. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram. And so the Israelites are a Semitic people going back to Shem. But by understanding the Proto-Semitic genome, we can get closer to the idea of the ancient Israelites' genome. Furthermore, whatever genome Proto-Semites had in the ancient Israelites, then we should see this same genetic data in the descendants of the Hebrews of Israel to some degree. With that being said, let's begin. So, the North African origins of Proto-Semites is perhaps one of the best origins from an older perspective with respect to the Levant origin. Proto-Semites would have been in the green wet Sahara during the pastoral Neolithic. From North Africa, Semites would migrate into the Levant, Palestine, Syria. From the Levant, Proto-Semites would migrate to Mesopotamia. So this is a great book, the Semitic Languages Outline of a Comparative Grammar by E. Lipsky. And so it reads in the yellow, "This implies that the speakers of Proto-Semitic were still dwelling in Africa in the 5th millennium BC, in the Neolithic subplume, circa 5,500 through 3,500 BC, when the Sahara's climate was much wetter, so that erosion took place, as in other moist temperate or subtropical regions, that there was a proper system of rivers and vegetation consisting of grass with trees. A worsening of environmental conditions is indicated in North Africa circa 3,500 BC, with disappearance of vegetation, a major faunal break, desertification, and desertion. This might have been the period when the speakers of Proto-Semitic passed through the Nile Delta from the west to the east and reached Western Asia, where written document of the 3rd millennium BC preserve noticeable traces of pre-Semitic, and in Mesopotamia also of pre-Sumerian substring. Thus, from North Africa, wave after wave of Semitic migrations would seem to have set forth. The earliest of these migrants and those who went furthest to the east were the Akkadians, who journeyed along the Fertile Crescent through Palestine and Syria, and crossing over into Mesopotamia, reached northern Babylon circa 3000 BC, and founded the first Semitic empire at Kish. The southern Semites would seem to have reached the moisture highlands of the Yemen and Hadranite after 2000 BC, following the collapse of the early Bronze Age culture in Palestine, while the Ethiopians would have crossed over to the Horn of Africa when drier conditions prevailed in South Arabia circa 15 through 500 BC. So, as that book just said, Semites would have came out of North Africa, wave after waves of them, during the wet green Sahara period, going into the Middle East, specifically the Levant, and then going into Mesopotamia. The latest paper on the origins of Semitic languages seems to have a similar type of understanding of this. This is the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages, identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East. So it says, our analysis of the Semitic language family our analysis of the Semitic language family produced a date phylogeny that estimated the origin of Semitic at approximately 4,400 through 7,400 YBP. These results indicate that the ancestor of all Semitic languages in our dataset was being spoken in the Middle East no earlier than approximately 7,400 YBP, after having diverged from Afroasiatic in Africa. The discovery of such early Semitic languages could increase estimates of the age of Semitic and alter its geographical origin if these early Semitic languages were found in Africa rather than in the Middle East. And so basically, as that paper just said in the other book, that Proto-Semitic would have came out of the Afroasiatic homeland in Africa and migrated into the Middle East. And the North African origins it's probably one of the best, as I said earlier. So linguistically and geographically, the North African origin of Proto-Semites is one of the best candidates in the field of science. Another great reason why a North African origin of Semites is plausible is because of genetics. Ancient and indigenous Middle Eastern populations have ancient North African DNA called Ibero-Maurusian. Ibero-Maurusians are the direct ancestors, or they're the direct descendants of the Basal Eurasians. Ancient Middle Easterners have Basal Eurasian ancestry as well, and indigenous ones too. High levels of Basal Eurasian ancestry were found in ancient Middle Eastern genomes, which negatively correlated with Neanderthal ancestry. Basal Eurasians may have less Neanderthal ancestry than other ancestral Eurasian lineages, and the extent to which Basal Eurasian ancestry is present may explain the extent to which Neanderthal ancestry is present in Middle Eastern genomes. For example, a high level of Basal Eurasian or Sub-Saharan African ancestry could be the underlying reason for the low level of Neanderthal ancestry in Qatari Bedouin in comparison to Europeans or other Middle Eastern populations. Bedouins, who have the greatest amount of autochthonous, or indigenous Arab genetic ancestry may be the direct descendants of basal Eurasians. So, as we just read, ancient Middle Eastern genomes and indigenous or autochthonous Arabians and Bedouins have direct ancestry to the basal Eurasians. And so, where did basal Eurasians reside? Well, this paper deals with it, origins of human ancestry, and it says the origins of basal Eurasian ancestry most likely centered around Southwest Asia and North Africa, and are unlikely to be connected to evidence of humans further away from Africa before 60 KA, or 60,000 years ago. And so here's a great map showing basal Eurasians. So ancient Middle Easterners, the basal Eurasians, and some basal Eurasians, of course, being in the Middle East, specifically around the Persian Gulf, would have also crossed into North Africa, and their closest descendants would be the ancestral North Africans, Ibero-Maurusians. This paper actually deals with it, as well as modern populations with this basal Eurasian Ibero-Maurusian ancestry. This paper is called Projecting Ancient Ancestry in Modern-Day Arabians and Iranians, a key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf on human populations. So it says, East Arabians also displayed the highest levels of the basal Eurasian lineage of all tested modern-day populations. So East Arabians have the highest levels of basal Eurasian ancestry. So anyways, it continues saying, not surprisingly, East Arabians were also the ones with higher similarity with Ibero-Maurusians, who were so far the best proxy for the basal Eurasians amongst the known ancient specimens. And so, East Arabians have high levels of Ibero-Maurusian ancestry. And again, Ibero-Maurusians are another great candidate for descendants of basal Eurasians. So continuing, it says, our results are strong evidence to include the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf as possible home of basal Eurasians to be investigated further namely by searching ancient Arabian human specimens. And so basically they're saying the homeland or the area that basal Eurasians would have reside was around the Persian Gulf region. So here's a map showing this. This is where basal Eurasians would have been around the Persian Gulf, which would be Iran, Iraq, Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Oman. So that's where the basal Eurasians would have been. And so continuing the reading of the study, it says also, the ancient Ibero-Maurusians specimens could be in part descendants of basal Eurasians, as they have a shared genetic affinity with early Paleocene Near Easterners. Best proxy are the Natufians, and 1/3 of input from sub-Saharan Africans, a mixture between West and East Africans. Thus, so far, Southwestern Asia is still the most plausible homeland for the hypothetical basal Eurasian population. So, just to summarize this part, ancient Ibero-Maurusians are descendants of basal Eurasians, and of course they share genetic relations with early Paleocene Near Easterners like the Natufians, and they even have some African DNA in them as well, which is fairly interesting. And so it says, modern Saudi Arabian and Yemeni samples cluster tightly in the lower left quadrant, overlapping with the 3 Natufian samples, and were close to the Levant PP&B, pre-Pottery Neolithic B, and PP&C, pre-Pottery Neolithic C, and Levant Bronze Age samples. A part of the modern UAE, or United Arab Emirates, and Oman samples were more dispersed and mingled with North African Ibero-Maurusian and North African early Neolithic in accordance with some sub-Saharan input in their genomes. So we do have Arabian, Middle Eastern populations with this ancient North African Ibero-Mauritian DNA, as well as Levantine connections, specifically PP&B, PP&C, and Bronze Age. And so now I'm going to show you the amount. When it comes to Oman and the United Arab Emirates, they have a decent amount of Ibero-Mauritian DNA. And when it comes to Yemen and Saudi Arabia, they have Levant PP&B DNA. And so now I'm going to show you a map when it comes to it. So as we can see, we have when it comes to the Ibero-Mauritians, A, which I highlight in red. This is where you see a high amount of Ibero-Mauritian DNA, which again is the A quadrant right here around the area of the Persian Gulf. And again, again, Oman and the United Arab Emirates, they have a good amount of Ibero-Mauritian DNA when it comes to the samples. So, ancient North African individuals, especially in Ibero-Mauritian samples, the same components were also found in part of modern samples from United Arab Emirates, UAE, and Oman, together with a few individuals from Yemen. 2/3 of the West AP, Arab Persian populations have ancestry shared with the Natufian, typical of the Levant. The similarity with the Ibero-Mauritian was higher in East than in West Arab Persian. The ancient Ibero-Mauritian sample included in the analysis was the one with the highest input of Basal Eurasian lineage, even higher than the ones observed in modern East Arab Persian Gulf populations. Not surprisingly, Cluster A, bearing still a means of 20% of sub-Saharan African admixture, was in a close position to the Ibero-Mauritian samples. The Ibero-Mauritians had a high signal in the Levant and West Arab Persian quadrant with a high Ibero-Mauritian Natufian similarity, followed by East Arab Persian, probably the Basal Eurasian similarity. So here's sort of a map showing people, those with the high Natufian ancestry, which typically is of the right-hand side of the Arabian Peninsula, or Western Arabia near the Red Sea. And our results reveal that the Eastern continuum was probably older, given the stronger signal of the Basal Eurasian lineage. The Ibero-Mauritians in that side of the Arab Persian, definitely the Ibero-Mauritian sample, are the ones bearing a high level of Basal Eurasian lineage, which could have been contributed by the sub-Saharan African input added by the Southwest Asian founder group, which moved to North Africa 20,000 years ago, bearing a high Basal Eurasian component. It is interesting that the current-day Southwest Asian populations that show more genetic sharing with Ibero-Mauritians are the East Arab Persian populations, confirmed a high portion of the Basal Eurasian lineage / Ibero-Mauritian founding effect in Cluster D, East Arab Persian in Iran, and F, West Arab Persian. Probably the Ibero-Mauritian samples are currently the best proxy for the Basal Eurasian population group. The highest levels of Basal Eurasian lineage found in East Arab Persian reinforce previous genetic and archaeological evidence of early human settlement in the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf. Thus, the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf is a possible homeland of Basal Eurasians. So, since ancient Middle Easterners and indigenous Middle Eastern populations have Basal Eurasian, Ibero-Mauritian, and Natufian ancestry, then we should know that Basal Eurasians, Ibero-Mauritians, and Natufians Y DNA haplogroup in their Y chromosome, which was haplogroup E. What likely happened is that haplogroup DE originated in the Middle East, then haplogroup E migrated back into Africa, specifically North Africa, then migrated back into the Middle East, bringing Afro-Asiatic and Semitic languages. So this paper deals with exactly what I just said. Carriers of mitochondrial DNA, microhaplogroup L3 basal lineages migrated back to Africa from Asia around 70,000 years ago. So it reads, the split of the Y chromosome composite DE haplogroup is very similar to the age of mtDNA L3, and Eurasian origin and back migration to Africa has been proposed for the African Y chromosome haplogroup E. This correlation rather seems to be the result of a joint and global replacement of the autochthonous or indigenous male and female African lineages by the new Eurasian incomers. So basically, they're saying haplogroup E seems to have migrated into Africa, being originally a Eurasian type of people, and they sort of replaced or overpopulated the autochthonous or indigenous Africans. So this goes with this paper. This section of the paper even talks about the origins, or where we see high levels of the first E clades. It says, curiously, ancestral E star lineages have been detected in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. So we find some of the most ancestral E lineages in Arabia and the Levant region. So, a new study concluded that there was a massive migration of non-African Eurasians back into Africa about 70,000 years ago, spreading the Eurasian haplogroups, such as E and its parent DE within Africa, before additional waves of Eurasian admixture. Modern Africans thus are descendant of Paleo-Africans and Afro-Sans, which migrated in Africa between 70,000 years to 40,000 years ago. And the paper for that is Ancient Admixture into Africa from the Ancestors of Non-Africans. And so frequency of Y DNA haplogroup E in modern populations and hypothetical migration route from its ancestor clade DE in Southwest Asia, the Middle East. Haplogroup E arrived in Africa about 77,000 years ago and diversified in the Horn of Africa. It arrived together with specific West Eurasian alleles and later also diffused into various Paleo-African populations, as well as among the ancient North Africans, which were a population indigenous to North Africa and distinctly related or ancestral to modern West Eurasians. Haplogroup E and DE have a Middle Eastern origin. Haplogroup E migrated into Africa as part of a massive migration of Basal Eurasians, ancestral West Eurasians, and then diffused and diversified within Africa, specifically the Horn of Africa, Northeast Africa. Haplogroup DE next to CF, where the Basal Eurasian lineages which expanded from the Middle East. The common ancestral lineage, Y DNA atom, is suggested to have originated somewhere in the Middle East or the Iranian plateau. A massive Eurasian migration and following admixture created the many different African populations of today and are the reason for the high genetic diversity observed in sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, modern African people, sub-Saharan Africans, formed from indigenous Paleo-African groups and intrinsic Afro-Sans, Basal Eurasians, and ancient North Africans. Finally, there is the fact why haplogroup E is dominant among non-hunter-gatherers in Africa, and it is within the Eurasian clade DE, while indigenous African hunter-gatherers belong to haplogroups A, A00, and B. So basically, to sum up this paper, Basal Eurasians brought haplogroup E into Africa. They would have became the descendants of Basal Eurasians would have been the ancient North Africans, and basically they've been migrating back and forth to the Middle East and Africa. But these haplogroup E individuals, the Basal Eurasians, the ancestral ancient North Africans, would have basically been a Eurasian type of people, whereas the indigenous Africans were hunter-gatherers and they had haplogroups A and B, which from an old Earth and even a young Earth perspective would be the Hamites. But let's keep going further. This map actually shows haplogroup E coming into Africa from the Middle East and going into North Africa, pushing haplogroup A and B southwards. And as we can see over here, haplogroup A and B are your true African, whereas haplogroup E is an Afro-Mediterranean or Afro-Middle Eastern type of haplogroup. So this paper, this is a summarization of a paper dealing with the ancient North Africans and their Y-DNA haplogroup and genetic relations to certain populations. So it's from the Lostrich 2018 study, analyzed genome-wide data from 7 ancient individuals from the Ibero-Maurusian Grotte des Pigeons site near Terferault in northeastern Morocco. The scientists found that all males belong to haplogroup E1b1b, common among Afroasiatic males. The male specimens with sufficient nuclear DNA preservation belong to the paternal haplogroup E1b1b1A1 M78, with one skeleton bearing the E1b1b1A1 1b1 parent lineage to E-V13. One male specimen belonged to E1b1b M215. These Y-DNA clades 24,000 years ago had a common ancestor with the Berbers, and the E1b1b1b1 M123 subclade that has been observed in skeletal remains belong to the Epio-Paleolithic Natufian and pre-Pottery Neolithic cultures of the Levant. A two-way admixture scenario using Natufian and modern sub-Saharan African samples, including West Africans and the Tanzanian Hadza, as reference populations, inferred that the 7 Torfa-Alt individuals are best modeled genetically as of 63.5% Natufian related and 36.5% sub-Saharan African ancestry, with the latter having both West African-like and Hadza-like affinities. Y-DNA analysis shows that the Torfa-Alt males all belong to Y-DNA haplogroup E1b1b1A1 M78, which is closely related to the E1b1b1 M123 subhaplogroup that has been observed in skeletal remains belonging to the Epio-Paleolithic Natufian and pre-Pottery Neolithic cultures of the Levant. And so this paper literally goes into the connections between North Africans and Near Easterners. It's called Pleistocene North African Genomes Link Near Eastern and Sub-Saharan African Human Populations. So it says, we analyzed the genetic affinities of the Torfa-Alt individuals by performing principal component analysis, PCA, and model-based clustering of worldwide data. When projected onto the top PCs of African and West Eurasian populations, the Torfa-Alt individuals form a distinct cluster in an intermediate position between present-day North Africans and East Africans, consistently we find that all males with sufficient nuclear DNA preservation carries Y haplogroup E1B1B1A1 M78. The closely related E1B1B1 M123 haplogroup has been reported for Epio-Paleolithic Natufians and pre-Pottery Neolithic Natufians. Unsupervised genetic clustering also suggests a connection of Torfa-Alt to the Near East. The three major components that comprise the Torfa-Alt genomes are marginalized by early Paleocene Levantines, East African hunter-gatherers Hadza from north-central Tanzania, and West Africans. We calculated outgroup statistics of the form across worldwide ancient and present-day test populations. Consistent with previous analysis, we find that ancient Near Eastern populations, especially Epio-Paleolithic Natufians and early Neolithic Levantines, show the highest outgroup values with Torfa-Alt. And so this is from the supplementary materials of the same paper. It says when only the genetic variation of West Eurasians is taken into account to construct PCs, we find the Torfa-Alt individuals to fall outside the genetic variation of present-day West Eurasians. Consistent with the global and African PCAs, the Torfa-Alt individuals form a type cluster between Bedouins, who we talked about earlier, have this connection with Basal Eurasians and being indigenous people. So the Torfa-Alt individuals form a type cluster between Bedouins and East African nomadic groups. Fairly interesting. So pre-Proto-Semites would migrate out of North Africa into, Syria, Palestine. These pre-Proto-Semites would have had Ibero-Maurusian DNA. Furthermore, these pre-Proto-Semites would have had haplogroup E. As we just read from the Semitic languages outline a comparative grammar by E. Lipsky, this implies that the speakers of Proto-Semitic were dwelling in Africa in the 5th millennium BCE, in the Neolithic subplume, circa 5,500 through 3,500 BCE, when the Sahara's climate was much wetter, so that erosion took place, as in other moist, temperate, or subtropical regions, and there was a popular system of rivers and vegetation consisting of grass with trees. So, this is from In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory by John D. Bingston, and he says, the overall pattern is consistent with a model of the first speakers of Afro-Asiatic having emerged in or near North Africa, or in or near the Horn of Africa or the Nile Valley. The presence of Semitic in the Near East might be explained as follows. Early pre-Proto-Semitic speakers would have migrated into Syrio-Palestine before the Neolithic, being taken by their M35 bearers, specifically M35 and M78. So these early Proto-Semites or pre-Proto-Semites, ancestral Semites, would have carried haplogroup E. This paper says the same thing. This is how Eurasia was born, and it reads, the most simple solution for the discrepancy between high genetic diversity in the Levant and high linguistic diversity in Africa could be that Semitic is a result of a relatively late re-migration from North Africa or the ancient Canaan after ancestors of the other branches of Afro-Asiatic migrated to Africa. This is also supported by the fact that otherwise E-M78 and even its primary subclades are much older by multiple times than the presumed age of language families analyzed in this paper and my earlier papers, as timing of TMRCAs of the primary subclades is the following: 10,000 BC for E-Z1902 and 9900 BCE for E-Z 1919. So, going back to what this paper said with the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East. Reading only in yellow, it says, the results indicate that the ancestor of all Semitic languages in our dataset was being spoken in the Near East no earlier than approximately 7,400 YBP, after having diverged from Afro-Asiatic in Africa. So again, all these papers are saying pre-Proto-Semitic basically came out of Africa and, entered the Near East. And so continuing, it says, the map also presents the dispersal of Semitic languages inferred from our study. An origin of Afro-Asiatic along the African coast of the Red Sea, supported by comparative analysis, is indicated in red, although other African origins of Afro-Asiatic have been proposed, such as southwest Ethiopia. The assumed location of the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afro-Asiatic between the African coast of the Red Sea and the Near East is indicated in italics. So basically, here's the origins of the Afro-Asiatic being in northeastern Africa. Then you have ancestral Semitic sort of in between, around the area of the Red Sea, and then Proto-Semitic being in the Levant. So they would have, Proto-Semites would have came out of northeastern Africa and went into the Levant region. So all of this seems to be implying the same thing. And when you add genetics to it, it makes a lot of sense. This paper, Genetics, Egypt, and History, actually deals with this. By the way, it's called Genetics, Egypt, and History, Interpreting Geographical Patterns of Y Chromosome Variation by S.O.Y. Kita. So it says, it can be postulated that select M35 carriers, speakers from Africa of an stage of ancestral Semitic, pre-Proto-Semitic, entered the Near East. So, like all these papers are saying, these early Semites would have carried E markers, and these would be ancestral Semitic populations. Pre-Proto-Semitic means ancestral Semitic, by the way. And they would have carried their haplogroup from Africa into the Middle East. And Peter Solomons also basically says the same thing. My theory is that when the Proto-Semitic language left the Afro-Asiatic homeland of Northeast Africa, not just one lineage left, but a group of Proto-Semitic people from this region that included all the Y DNA haplogroups then present in Northeast Africa. It is possible that Northwest Semitic, Hebrew people, and languages dispersed into the Levant from Northeast Africa's now region around 5000 BC. Thus, the earliest out of Africa settlement of Proto-Semitic people was likely in Yemen on the southeast region of the Arabian Peninsula. They then spread to the east and northeast to enter Mesopotamia and found the Semitic kingdom of Akkad and the Akkadian Empire. In this group, many of us conclude that haplogroup E is one of the major founding haplogroups of the Semitic people, and that haplogroup E people were the ones who brought Proto-Semitic language out of the Afro-Asiatic homeland in Northeast Africa into the Levant and Mesopotamia. So that pretty much sums up everything that I've been saying, but we can go deeper. This right here actually goes a little bit further into it. It says E-M34 doesn't come close to predominating anywhere, but is prominent in the southern Levant, Cyprus, Ethiopia, and the Jewish diaspora, with significant appearances in Kurdistan, the South Caucasus, Arabia, Iberia, Italy, Egypt, and the Maghreb. M34's direct ancestor, E-Z830, was found this year in Natufian samples from northern Israel, but IIRC E-M34's earliest station in the record is in the PPNB individual from Al Ghazan in Jordan. A bit earlier, one of its major subclades, E-M84, was identified in Iron Age individuals from Armenia. A Levantine origin seems plausible. A few years ago, it was probably common to see people identifying E-M34 as a marker of the Proto-Semites, but it's become obvious from the distribution that the truth is hairier. E-M34 has left a trail all across the Mediterranean, East Africa, and highland West Asia, where it's unlikely that Semitic languages were ever spoken. Naturally, this year's DNA findings seems to confirm some link between early Semitic speaking populations and E-M34. E-M35 originating in the ancestral homeland of Afroasiatic in East Africa, and thus the homeland of Proto-Semitic. E-M35 is the major founding lineage of all Semitic people in this hypothesis. E-M34 was the founding lineage of East Semitic people as a first wave Neolithic Chalcolithic period out of Africa distribution to southern Arabia and Mesopotamia, either through North Africa and the Levant. And/or was often postulated before the 2016 Natufian ancient DNA findings across the Manteb Strait, the 40-kilometer stretch of water between the tip of East Africa and Yemen. Thus, E-M34 would have been one of the founding lineages of the East Semitic Akkadian people and language. This first wave might be related to the Natufian settlement in the Levant, or more likely followed shortly after the success of their migration. E-M34 people in this hypothesis are descendant from the same ancestral people group as the Natufians, who lived in the East African Proto-Semitic tribal homeland before migrating to the Levant. And so that kind of fits with what the language paper said about the migration of these Semites. And again, just going to quickly read this. This map also presents a dispersal of Semitic languages inferred from our study and origin of Afroasiatic along the African coast of the Red Sea, supported by comparative analysis, is indicated in red, although other African origins of Afroasiatic have been proposed, such as southwest Ethiopia. The assumed location of the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afroasiatic between the African coast of the Red Sea and the Near East is indicated in italics right here. So, again, all of this is important because we're trying to find the likely genome and the likely origin of the ancestors of Israel, Proto-Semitic, pre-Proto-Semitic people, because we know the Israelites descend from Shem. And again, this is from an old earth perspective using academia. So we know that when it comes to Semitic languages, we see that it's spoken as far east as Iraq to as far west as Mauritania and Western Africa. And this is, of course, a map of the Semitic languages. And the map of Semitic languages perfectly overlaps with haplogroup E. And find that to be very interesting. As we see from an old earth perspective, Proto-Semites would likely be Africans. Genetically, these early Semites would have had a strong ancient North African influence, Ibero-Maurusian, which is still seen in indigenous Middle Easterners. So we have Basal Eurasians to Ibero-Maurusians to Natufians, all being the ancestors of Proto-Semites. Haplogroup E will be the paternal lineage of Proto-Semites. This is important to know because the ancient Israelites would have also had this ancient North African and Levantine influence, as well as haplogroup E marker. Furthermore, so should the descendants of Israel today. This is the genome I will look for when it comes to the Israelites' Semitic side, both ancient and modern Israelites. So, basically, again, ancient North African Ibero-Maurusian and Levant PPNB Natufian ancestry. Haplogroup E will be the paternal lineage. An ancient Israelite should have a genetic makeup something to this degree, like their Arabian cousins, the Jokhtanites. Otherwise, likewise, the descendants of the Hebrews should have a similar genetic makeup to their Joktanite brothers. Basically, ancient North African and Natufian Levantine DNA. But overall, from an old Earth perspective, ancient North Africa would play a very huge role in the genetic makeup of Proto-Semites. This obviously would make sense if their origins are in North Africa, like many linguists say. Furthermore, from an old Earth perspective, early Semites quite literally would be Africans. And it's not just me saying this. It's literally PhD historians and linguists. This is from Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. And it says, Greenberg determined that Semitic languages really form only one of 6 or more branches of a much larger language family, Afroasiatic. Even the Semitic subfamily itself is mainly African, 12 of its 19 surviving languages being confined to Ethiopia. This suggests that Afroasiatic languages arose in Africa and that only one branch of them spread to the Near East. Hence, it may have been Africa that gave birth to the languages spoken by the authors of the Old and New Testaments and the Quran, the moral pillars of Western civilization. And this is from a conversation with Christopher Ehret, and it reads, after all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. So we made it to the end of the video. This is where we conclude the genotype of Proto-Semites from an old Earth perspective. And again, this was a summary of the playlist that I had, and hopefully all this makes sense. Leave a comment for any questions you might have. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and click the bell. And as I said at the beginning of the video, you can contact me and find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as well. And with all that being said, Shalom.